Okay, do you think we should go ahead and get started? Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our RTAP bi-monthly webinar series. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation, Transportation in the ADA, Going Beyond Basic Accessibility. My name is Peyton, and I'm a GRA here at KUTC RTAP. Please feel free to add your names and agencies in the chat box. Seems like some people are already doing that. That's great. And in the meantime, I will just go over some housekeeping rules before introducing the speaker. Please remember to keep yourself muted during the duration of the presentation, as there will be a Q&A session at the end. But if you do have questions during the presentation, please feel free to just put them in the chat box and we can address them later on. I'll also be adding my email, or I already have added my email in the chat box in case you run into technical difficulties. And please feel free to reach out to me with any other concerns as well. Today's speaker is Jane Mahoney. Jane is a training and technical assistance specialist for the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center. She has extensive experience working with caregiver support programs, transportation coordination, and accessibility. Jane has a social work degree from Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, and is a certified ADA coordinator and AIRS certification. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Jane. You want to go ahead and start sharing your screen.
Awesome. See if we can do this correctly the second time. Worked before. They're looking like you're seeing the right thing.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the introduction, Peyton, and thanks for asking me to present today. I'm excited to talk about transportation in the ADA and have a lot of slides. So it's always hard to know what people know and don't know. So if I'm going too fast, feel free to, ask a question or slow me down. And we'll see if we can get through this all. If there are questions that I don't know the answer to, because I don't know everything, I will take them down and get back to you within a couple days. I have been working at NADTC, as we call the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center, for almost a year and a half. And I would say that working with the ADA aspect of this is probably one of my favorite parts. In case, see if I can get my thing to work there. In case you guys are not familiar with NADTC, I just want to talk just a little bit about that. So we are a federally funded technical assistance center that is managed jointly by Easter Seals and US Aging, and I do work for Easter Seals. And the goal of our center is to promote the availability of accessible transportation options that serve the needs of older adults, people with disabilities, caregivers, and communities. So that's our mission. And we strive to meet that mission by providing person-centered technical assistance and information. So we're available via email or phone to answer any kind of individual questions that you might have. And I encourage you, if you run into something that you're like, I don't know how to do this, or I'm not sure how to respond to this, to go ahead and use that service that we have. We also provide education and training, such as this training. We do a lot of virtual webinars, lunch and learns. We do presentations at conferences, just trying to educate and train transit staff around the country to help them provide good transportation to older adults, people with disabilities, and caregivers. So our training covers a lot of different areas, all related to transportation for those populations. We also have a focus on partnership coordination, because we really understand the power of coordination and partnerships, both in terms of coordinating with others in the field of transportation, as well as other agencies who serve older adults and people with disabilities to work together to provide better service. And then we also have some community grants that we provide most years, and we're in the middle, actually nearing the end of our current grant phase, and we have 7 grantees that are working on some really great projects. And all that information can be found on our website. I will say our next event that we have coming up is a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Lunch and Learn, and that's next Wednesday. And it's called Access Matters, and it's introducing some redesigned videos that train transit drivers and other transit staff to provide better service to people with disabilities. And that's next Wednesday at 11 Central Time. I just want to give you a peek at what our website looks like, because I'm very visual and I think that's helpful. So when you go to nabtc.org, this is our main page, and I'm going to show you my favorite tabs. The first is the training and events tab, and there you'll find any upcoming trainings as well as past trainings where you can watch the videos and see the materials from that. Also in that tab is a new learning center. Well, it's relatively new. And we have some video shorts. So they're about 12-minute little videos that introduce something relatively simple, but really helpful in your work. And then transportation resources is a tab where you can find all of our documents, trend reports, case studies, info briefs, toolkits, things like that. And there's a nice search mechanism that you can use to find materials. And then our blog, we do a monthly blog, and those are always interesting to read as well. And then lastly, one of my very favorite things is we have a photo resource gallery that highlights photos taken around the country. We usually have a photo contest and people submit photos, and that's where we gather our gallery from. And so these photos are free for you to use. You just have to sign up. So I'm going to be highlighting a lot of those photos in this presentation. So today we're going to be going over ADA and demand response transportation specifically, as well as a bit about reasonable modification of policy, practices, and procedures, a little bit on service animals. We're going to touch on hidden disabilities, and then handling some unexpected situations. Got to go over our disclaimer. NABTC, we strive to provide accurate information on the Americans with Disabilities Act, also called the ADA. But what we provide is technical assistance and not legal advice. And just that the information that's presented here is neither a determination of legal rights and responsibilities under the ADA or any other law, but instead it's to be used as informal guidance, and the views expressed are the opinions of me, the speaker. So really quick, just the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law in 1990 by President Bush. So that's a lot of years ago by now. And we have a lot of work to go to really get the whole law in place. And there's a lot of work going on to try to do that. But the law extended the requirements that were made under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And it was intended to eliminate discrimination on the basis of disability in the various categories of employment, state and local government programs, private business, and public and private transportation. So the ADA and transportation, ADA is not just tied to federal funding. So regulations apply to both private and public entities. So providers such as airport shuttles, hotel shuttles, private buses, taxis, TNCs, those all need to follow the ADA. And all of those services need to be accessible to people with disabilities. And then also the ADA rules that apply to transportation are regulated by the United States Department of Transportation. Requirements include various things. First of all, accessible equipment and features on the vehicle. So lifts and ramps, securement devices, signage and communication devices, things like that. That's all part of the ADA requirements. Also includes adequate boarding time for riders, and not just adequate boarding time, but boarding time with courtesy and respect. Drivers need to be trained proficiency in working with people with disabilities and providing transportation for them. And ADA complementary paratransit is specific to fixed route service areas, which we won't be getting into today. We have a ton of information about that on our website. But ADA also includes demand response service, which requires that an equivalent service is available. The ADA requirements also include accessible features such as bus stops and stations in order for people to use the transportation that's available. So there's my intro about the ADA. And we're just going to dive into Americans with Disabilities Act and demand response transportation. There is the FDA Circular 4710.1. Chapter 7 is specifically geared to tell you about demand responsive transportation. And there's links throughout this presentation about it because that's the most direct information about it. So just again, this is not the same as ADA complimentary paratransit. The rules are different for demand response services. And demand response includes things like dial ride services, one call, one click, taxi subsidy services, van pool services, route deviation. All of these things fall under demand responsive services. And what the ADA says is that an equivalent service must be provided to people with disabilities in the most integrated settings. So whatever service you're providing to the population that doesn't have disabilities also needs to be made available to people with disabilities. And not only that it's equivalent, but also to provide it in the most integrated setting, which would mean like providing services on the same vehicles and together with other riders as much as possible. There are 7 characteristics of equivalent service that the FTA gives guidance on. So these are the areas that need to be the same for riders who have disabilities and who don't have disabilities. I'll go over them briefly. Some are relatively self-explanatory, but response time is the first one, and that would be the elapsed time between the time someone requests the service and for the provision of that service. Meaning days and hours to request in advance need to be the same, as well as wait time, although that might come up later. So in order to make that happen, agencies do need to have accessible vehicles in reserve or have plans to acquire a vehicle so that if somebody requests a ride that is in a wheelchair, they will be able to within, if you have a day, you have to have your ride reserved a day in advance. That has to be the same if you are a wheelchair user or not, for an example. Fares is the second equivalent service characteristic. So you cannot charge more money for someone who needs an accessible vehicle. The fares need to be the same for all people, regardless of ability. Geographic area of service also needs to be the same. So someone with a disability has the same geographic area. So they can't, they have a disability, we'll take them outside of that. You don't have to do that. It just needs to be equivalent for both. Same for hours and days of service. In that case, I could see that maybe you don't have access to an accessible vehicle. Weekends, for whatever reason, that's not okay. You have to, if you provide a service on the weekend for people without a disability, that same service needs to be provided for someone with a disability. And restrictions or priorities based on trip purpose. Again, if you are taking people to the mall or social outings that don't have disabilities, the same must apply to people who need an accessible vehicle. And then the last two, availability of information and reservations capability. So riders with disabilities need to have access to the same information and reservation system as the other riders. So that would probably mean you need to have information in alternate formats. So large print, or people with visual disability need to have a way to get the information that anybody with that can see it can get it. Sorry, that didn't come out very well, but I think you know what I mean. So you just need to have the information available in multiple formats so anybody can access it. And then the last is that any constraints on capacity or serviceability needs to be the same for people with or without disabilities. So things like trip denials, service based on first come, first served, waiting list, trip caps, that's all okay to have for someone with a disability as long as it happens with the same frequency as it happens to somebody without a disability. So we can't have trip denials that 50% of people needing a wheelchair accessible vehicle have had their trips denied, and only 5% of people without vehicles or without wheelchairs have had their trips denied. That would not be okay. So that just needs to be equivalent. Same for any of those types of things. Waiting list, there can't be a longer waiting list for someone with a disability. So those are all okay to have as long as they occur with the same frequency. I feel like I've been talking fast. Are there any questions at this point on any of this? There will definitely be time at the end for questions too. Okay, I'm going to keep going. We get a lot of requests to talk about reasonable modification to policy, practices, and procedures. And there's a lot of information out there about this. Title 49 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 37, is all about transportation for individuals with disabilities. And the Appendix E to that Part 37 is reasonable modification of policies, practices, and procedures, and it gives some nice examples. So those are a couple of resources that you might want to check out. And then also this applies to Title 49, Part 27, which talks about the non-discrimination on the basis of disability in programs that receive federal funding. So agencies are required to make reasonable modifications to their policies, their practices, or procedures in order to avoid discrimination and to ensure that their programs are accessible to individuals with disabilities. So what is reasonable? Reasonable is defined as fair and sensible, not extreme or excessive, and possessing sound judgment. And it's really up to the local agency to determine if the requests are considered reasonable. And there's very little black and white when we're talking about reasonable modification. And I know sometimes it's nice to be like, just say, is this okay or not? It's like, there's a lot of it depends. Where does reasonable modification apply? It applies to fixed route, it applies to demand responsive transportation, private shuttles, complementary paratransit. It's just really applies to everything. And it really there should be a local process that would be set by the transportation provider as to how to handle reasonable modification requests. And it all follows the origin to destination guideline. And likely these types of modifications already are being provided in some form. Origin to destination is an important part of reasonable modification for demand response here. And that is that drivers are expected to provide assistance from the person's origin to their destination. And really that means door-to-door service. So an independent person doesn't need to be accompanied, but might be needed to be observed. But you could offer that arm and hand assistance. And also always want to reiterate that a driver is never responsible for door-through-door services. That would be a local decision if your agency or your service provides that, but that is not an ADA requirement. So when does reasonable modification have to be made? It has to be made unless it would fundamentally alter the nature or unless it would fundamentally alter the nature of the program, the service, or your activity, or unless it would result in a direct threat to the health or safety of others. Or without the requested modification, the individual with a disability would not fully be able to use the entity's service, programs, or activities for their intended purposes. So those are sort of the 3 times that you would have to make the reasonable modification. Those are kind of what we keep going back to when we're trying to determine. So in defining what a fundamental alteration of service is, it would be a modification that's so significant that it alters the essential nature of the goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantages, or accommodations offered. So if the request that they're making kind of changes the scope of the service that you provide, it could be denied. Case-by-case basis, really all of these reasonable modification requests need to be made on a case-by-case basis. So again, it's almost never a simple yes or no. It's like, let's hear more about this case. And you need to really have some sort of an interactive process in place in order to make the determination as to whether or not that reasonable modification can be made, whether it's reasonable or not, and whether it can be made. And communication is absolutely key. In determining if the reasonable modification is granted, you need to be communicating with the person who made the request and with the drivers and other people that are involved in providing the transportation. The suggestions for a workable solution can sometimes come from the person that's requesting it. It might sometimes come from the driver. It might come from a discussion that you're having about, can you make this work for them? It's really about, focus really needs to be about filling in the gaps of accessibility with really good customer service and flexibility. So I guess we try to think of ADA as, you're not just following the letter of the law, but it's really going beyond. The ADA is the bare bones minimum of what needs to be provided. So if you try to get out of this whole, I have to do this because there's a law about it, but thinking about, we provide transportation and we want to get people where they want to go. And so you're really trying to do what you can with customer service, with flexibility to make that ride happen. A few additional requirements. And one is that information about reasonable modification, the process of how to request it, has to be available to the public, and it needs to be accessible to everyone. So it should be very easy for someone who wants to use your service to see that, oh, if I can't quite use it, oh, there is a way, a process for me to request a reasonable modification. And really, we recommend that there is a full policy about how to go about doing that. The process in your policy must provide for situations when making an advance request is not feasible. Ideally, someone who wants to use your service sees and knows about it in advance and can make an advance request. Hey, we have someone pick me up at this location instead of this because I can't make it to that destination or whatever their request might be. It's great if it happens beforehand, but there needs to be a mechanism for those decisions to be made without that advance request. So it might be allowing a bus driver to make a determination, or having a way for a driver to contact the supervisor for assistance for an on-the-spot decision. So that needs to be part of your process. And then also that it specifically says that customers do not have to use the words reasonable modification when making their request. And I feel that kind of gets back to the following the letter of the law. Really what we want to do is get people where they want to go. So someone says, boy, I could use the bus if, they don't have to say, I'm making a reasonable modification request. So now what we call the fun part, unless there's questions, I'll go forward with just kind of going through some examples because I feel like that's a good way to get a grasp. The first we get a lot of questions. Can we ask someone what their disability is? And no, you really should not be asking what someone's disability is directly. What you really need to know and want to know is, what is it about their functional ability that doesn't allow them to take the trip as is? It's like, what is it that you need in order to make the trip happen? And then you can determine if that modification is reasonable. Some examples, food and drink. This is a very common one. Sometimes customers with diabetes or other kind of medical condition, there's a rule that there's no food or drink on your vehicle, but some of those people with some medical conditions need to be allowed to eat or drink on a vehicle or at stops or stations so that they avoid adverse consequences. So that would be considered a modification to allow, to go break your policy of no food or drink in order to accommodate their disability. Adjusting a boarding location. This also could be a reasonable modification. So when scheduling a trip, a passenger might request the bus operator to slightly adjust the boarding location of a designated pickup or drop-off point so that the individual with using a wheelchair might board from an accessible location. And even if the request for that pickup point is a little difficult to maneuver, it should be considered. So really the only hazard is if there's a hazard for the vehicle, or if it could harm other passengers in like making unsafe, like taking the vehicle in an unsafe place. Other than that, it really should not be denied, and you should be able to make a slight change in the boarding location. Medications. You may have a passenger's request to take a medication or administer insulin or do a finger stick on a trip, should generally be granted while taking that trip. We don't feel like that would be a fundamental alteration of the function of a driver. However, if the person would ask for a driver to help with the administration of medication, that would not be okay. So that would be a fundamental alteration. That's not their job function. Personal care attendants, transit drivers, providers cannot require that a passenger travel with a personal care attendant. However, they can encourage the user to have a personal care attendant. And if the rider asks a driver to act as a personal care attendant to provide a service that a personal care attendant would typically provide, that would be a fundamental alteration and that would be denied. So can't force a rider to bring a personal care attendant with, but drivers do not have to perform any type of task that would be considered something that a PCA would do. Waiting with a passenger. Sometimes a request is made for a driver to wait with a passenger whose disability makes it unsafe for them to remain alone while unattended. And this is one of those kind of really gray things. If this is a demand response, and if there's other people in the vehicle that have to get somewhere, that would be an alteration of service and probably could be denied because it's affecting other people. But there might be times when it's okay for the passengers and it might not be considered disruptive to other riders. So that's going to be a real case by case basis. There are things called safe harbor policies, which state that a passenger with a disability that would be unsafe to be left alone, like they're at their drop-off point and the person there to pick them up is not there. Wouldn't force the driver to sit and wait, but it might be something where the rider could stay on that vehicle while the route continues and then dispatch them, kind of figure out what to do. So there's all kinds of little gray areas here. Lifting passengers, a request for a driver to lift a passenger out of their mobility device should be denied because of the safety, dignity, and privacy issues that are implied by this action. Lifting or carrying a passenger is really a personal care attendant related service, and it's outside of the scope of a driver's duties. So except in a case of emergency evacuation, that would be considered a fundamental alteration of service and would not need to happen. Packages and luggage, a request for operators to help with packages or luggage generally should be granted as long as the weight or the number of the packages is reasonable. However, someone may request that the driver bring the packages into their home or apartment, and that would not be okay because that's that door-through-door that does not have to be required. Now, you may have a local policy where you do that, and that's fine, but it is not an ADA required service. It would actually be taking the passengers into their home would be considered more of a personal care attendant duty. Seat belts. Sometimes a passenger in a wheelchair or mobility device will say they don't want to wear a seatbelt. And unless everyone is forced to wear a seatbelt, you cannot force somebody with a disability to wear a seatbelt. So if there's a policy that wearing a seatbelt is optional, it needs to be optional for everyone. Intermediate stops. Sometimes there's a request to stop at a pharmacy, particularly like on the way home from a medical appointment, and then the driver would be required to wait, and that would be considered optional. Again, it would be determined by the other people that might be in the vehicle and the whole situation. But requests that could disrupt schedules and inconvenience other passengers could be considered a fundamental alteration of service and be denied. But if it works into the route that day, it is fine to accommodate that request. Service area and hours. So a request for service outside of the transit agency's service area or outside of the hours that they operate would not be considered a reasonable modification. That needs to be provided the same for everyone. So they need to, if they have a request for a service outside the hours or the area, that would be a no, because it's considered a fundamental alteration of service. Payment for ride. Sometimes there's a request that someone with a disability would like a free ride, and that is considered a fundamental alteration of the service as well. It's unequal treatment to have some riders not pay and some riders pay, just as it would be not okay to charge more or charge less for certain people. Request to lower a ramp or a lift. Bus operators are required to lower the lift or ramp for anybody requesting to use it, and should be deployed without being asked why. Why do you need to use this? That is not okay to ask. You just, if there's a request for it, it needs to be provided. And that gets into the hidden disabilities that we'll talk about in just a little bit. Difficult driveways. There may be requests to come down a very long driveway or a gravel driveway, or maybe up a steep hill. So there, you might have policies about vehicles not entering certain driveways unless the vehicle can pick the person up without having to back up. So those are those gray areas. Again, you want to sit down and have a conversation and talk with the driver. Maybe you go out to the location and see, is there a possible way that we can do this? You want to try to work to make it happen, but it might not work, and that would be okay, because that would be a fundamental alteration to require a vehicle to drive, or it might be an unsafe situation as well. So, but some possible modifications would be, is there a way for the rider to meet the vehicle at the end of the driveway? Or like I said, perhaps to go out before the trip happens and just see if there's a place that they can figure out where they can turn around and make that happen. So this is that communication piece again. So those are some examples. There's more examples in the Appendix E to Part 37. And again, they're all just examples, and there are going to be things that come up that are not listed in that Appendix E that I have not covered, and feel free to contact our toll-free number or our email address if you have something specific to ask about. But in summary, you want to avoid asking directly about a person's disability, but instead you want to ask about the functional ability to take the trip without the modification. So they may request something, you can ask, would you be able to take this trip without making that modification? And sometimes it's like, well, yeah, I could, I just prefer it this way. So those are some things to remember. And when they do ask for a modification, ask yourself, is that reasonable? We talked about what reasonable is. Does it fundamentally alter your service? Is it requiring you to do something that is different than what your service really provides? Is it a direct threat to the health or safety of other passengers? And then finally, is this needed for you to take the trip? So those are some kind of overall ideas and things to think about as you're determining reasonable modification. I think that's a lot. Are there questions at this point, or shall I keep moving? I'm going to keep moving. All right. Service animals. The ADA. Always lots of questions about service animals. So service animals, according to the ADA, can accompany people with disabilities in vehicles and facilities. The Department of Transportation and regulations define a service animal as any guide dog, signal dog, or other animal individually trained to provide assistance to an individual with a disability. So including, but not limited to, it could be guiding individuals with impaired vision, alerting individuals with hearing impairment to intruders or sounds, providing minimal protection or rescue work, pulling a wheelchair, fetching dropped items. Those are some examples of what some service animals typically could do. If an animal's only function is to provide emotional support or comfort, that is not considered a service animal. Service animals are specifically trained to perform a specific task. So those comfort or emotional support animals don't really do a specific task. So the ADA does not disqualify service, but that would be a local transit decision. But according to the ADA, you do not have to allow comfort or emotional support animals on your vehicles. You can, but you do not have to. Sometimes someone might want to bring more than one animal with them, and that's okay, because a person may have two animals and they each perform a different function. They should notify dispatch at the time of a reservation just to let them know that they're bringing more than one animal. There's some common misconceptions about service animals. This hopefully will clear most of them up. The first we already talked about, emotional support animals are not service animals. Service animals are not required to wear a vest or have some sort of ID tag. That is not a requirement. Service animals do not have to be professionally trained by service animal trainers. They can be trained by their owners. Excuse me. Service animals do need to be under the control of their owners at all times, but that does not mean that they have to be on a leash. They just need to be in control. Service animals cannot block aisles or exits. That is a safety hazard to other riders. And if a city has a ban on a specific breed, that does not carry over and apply to service animals. Another thing that's not on here is you cannot ask for papers or some way to prove or a certification to prove that your animal is a service animal, but you can ask, what does this animal do? What is the thing that this animal does for you, the task that this animal does? You can ask that, but you cannot ask them to provide any sort of proof that it is a service animal. Hopefully I covered most of the questions on that. I want to talk just a little bit about hidden disabilities, sometimes called invisible disabilities. See here, not every disability is visible. And hidden disabilities is basically an umbrella term that refers to a spectrum of disabilities and challenges that are not immediately apparent to others. And there's a lot of them. But sadly, many of these people are often accused of faking or imagining their disability, which you can imagine would be very discouraging. The ADA defines an individual with a disability as someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. A person who has a record of such an impairment or is simply regarded as having such an impairment. So kind of going back to that definition of what a person with a disability is, and people with hidden disabilities can definitely fall into this definition. A tickle. So I've listed several examples of what hidden disabilities are, and this is just a small example. So hearing disorders, speech impediments, visual impairments, learning disabilities, chronic pain or chronic illness, sleep disorders, mental health disorders, epilepsy or seizure disorders, autism, brain injuries, Alzheimer's or other dementia, severe allergies, PTSD. These all are examples of hidden disabilities. Somebody with any one of these disabilities, you could look at them and not have a clue that they have any of these issues, but these all are things that could impair a person's ability to use your transportation program without some sort of modification. So serving people with hidden disabilities, a few things to remember. And again, kind of going back to, you don't ask the person what their disability is. That is not an approved thing to do, to ask them or to prove that they have a disability. Again, you can ask what it is that is preventing them from using your service as is, and then they can tell you specific thing that's preventing them, but they don't have to name what type of disability they have. Also, just really be careful and cognizant not to make an assumption about an ability or a disability of a person based on how they look. So a real clear example of this is the reserved seating areas in transit buses. Sometimes there'll be somebody sitting in that this is reserved for people with disabilities, and it's like, you don't have a disability, and someone else comes on and they want to sit there, to not make that assumption that they shouldn't be there, because they might be someone with chronic pain or someone that has dizzy spells and they need to sit down. You can't see that just by looking at them. You want to as to make sure you're serving people with hidden disabilities, you want to review all of your accessibility standards and make sure that your materials are accessible to everyone. So I'm talking about things like having large print material, having good color contrast in flyers or information that people get, having a way for someone with a visual disability to maybe hear the information as opposed to read it. People with cognitive disabilities might have a difficult time with information that's printed with too many big words or too many words. So just really be cognizant of using plain language when explaining how to use your service or doing outreach about what your service is. So any kind of accessibility standards, you want to just make sure things are available to anybody with any level of ability or disability. Another suggestion is really just to broaden your awareness of hidden disabilities. There's a lot of things on the web. I have a resource in the back or at the end of the presentation about hidden disabilities. So any kind of awareness that you can build on types of hidden disabilities. And depending on your community, you might have a smaller community. You might know of a few people that have a hidden disability or an organization that serves people. And you could even find out specifically like, hey, can you just teach us more about what PTSD is like or things like that. And then, if you say the wrong thing, just apologize and ask how you can do better. I think people are just really scared about offending people or asking the wrong thing. But you just need to communicate. Communication is so important. And you're going to say the wrong thing at some point, and that's okay. Apologize and then on. There are a couple of neat programs for people with hidden disabilities. The one that I'm the most aware of is the Hidden Disabilities Sunflower Lanyard Program. And it's a picture of it, the green lanyard with the yellow sunflowers on it. Usually has a tag, and then it can say, it shows the guy here is showing the backside. On the other side, it can say, please, loud noises scare me, or whatever it is that they need assistance with. There have also been movements for just people making their own, like groups of people, like we're just making our own self-identification buttons or tags. So there's a name tag that some people had made for, I have an invisible disability, please offer me a seat, which is kind of sad that they have to wear that, but it's a way for them to show that they do need some additional assistance. So that's all I have on hidden disabilities. I think a lot of that is just kind of an awareness thing. Love home alone. So handling unexpected situations, they're going to happen. So unexpected situations are going to happen. Things like a powered chair is low on power or maybe out of power. A rider is running out of oxygen. A rider might be forgot their medication or ran out on a long distance trip. Or you may have riders that are on a scooter that does not feel safe in your vehicle and they don't want to transfer to a seat. Or you notice that a rider's scooter just again is not safe and it's not crash tested. So what do? Obviously, first of all, try to keep your cool as much as possible. And if no immediate danger is present, obviously if there's some immediate danger, you're going to call 911. But if there's no immediate danger, the first thing is really just talk to the person. Very likely they have run into the similar situation in the past and they have ideas on what to do. Wow, looks like you're almost out of oxygen. As a driver, like, I don't know what to do, but they might know. And you can just ask them, so, has this ever happened to you before? Do you have ideas on what you need? And, it might just be, well, I'll probably be fine. But they'll probably are going to have ideas on what to do. So the very first thing is talk to the person and find out what exactly that they might need. And then as you're thinking through the situation, of course, safety is very important. Safety of the person there as well as safety of other people. And then likely and hopefully there are some sort of procedures that your organization has and you can work on following the procedures. And then just think through those viable options and communicate with the person again and talking through and just kind of go through, here's some ideas we could work through. And then of course, utilize your supervisor and hopefully in policies, you have a way to connect with them easily so that you can talk through some of that if needed. And we'll just go through a couple of these. The whole low on battery for electric wheelchair or low on oxygen or medication. Again, ask the person, do you have a solution that you have in mind? What has happened in other times that this has happened to you? And then just remember, like going without oxygen or missing a dose of medication, most often, not always, is not life-threatening. So don't panic. And again, check with that person. Don't make assumptions, but for them, if you get into the end of the trip and they've run out, you want to check with them, but it's probably not a life-threatening situation. Again, utilize the assistance of your road supervisor or your dispatch person or your supervisor to talk through it if need be. And as last resort, you would call for emergency help. And also, I just want to point out, these types of situations are really not ADA issues. These are more like a local policy or practice issue. These kinds of things are happening. It's not really an ADA thing. With like a low battery, so you're going to drop someone off and their battery is maybe it's dead. Like it is really difficult to push an electric wheelchair that doesn't have a working battery. So, do you have a neighbor? Is there someone that lives nearby? Who could we call to help with this? How far do you have to go? Is it just right there? So, work through that situation with the person. Unsafe scooters. You may have a local policy about scooters and you want to communicate with your supervisor about that. If they are refusing to transfer from the scooter to a seat, you can't force them if they don't want to transfer, but you can explain safety issues. And again, refer to local policy, but you can't deny the ride to somebody unless there is a direct threat to the health or safety of others. There is a way to crash test wheelchairs. You send them in. It's costly, so you can't really force people to do that either. Talking about sometimes, we can have them sign a waiver to release us from any liability, but the ADA is like a more powerful law than any type of release you have, so it's not really super helpful. So again, you can't deny the ride, but communicate, have discussions, talk about safer ways of doing things, and help provide the information that they need to be as safe as they can. Some strategies to try, these kinds of things too. It's like a prevention thing. As much as you're able to prevent people from having these situations is really the best thing to do. So creating some local policies, to before boarding our vehicle, your electric wheelchair must be fully charged, or if you have oxygen, you need to make sure you bring a full tank, or if it's a long trip, you may require them to have an extra tank. Having those local policies and making sure they're aware of them could help reduce the times that these situations happen. Providing travel training is super important. Really just help riders think about the preparation of a trip so that they're not just showing up without going through a series of, I got to make sure I have a coat. I got to make sure that I have my oxygen. I need to make sure I have my pills, just helping them think about the importance of preparing for their trip. Also, if you have a system where people call to schedule their ride or they call with questions, have the person taking those calls with maybe a reminder list so that they're scheduling a ride and then the person they schedule the ride with can kind of walk through that. If you have oxygen, make sure your tank is full. If you have an electric wheelchair, make sure your wheelchair is charged, so they can talk through that as they're calling to schedule their trip. You could consider like a pre-trip checklist that you could hand out. Drivers could have them and hand them out to passengers as they're riding to use the next time. Another great way to prevent these kinds of situations from happening. And then just making sure that your drivers and dispatchers have training on handling these types of situations and what to do in emergency situations. Because, there might be obviously times when like this is life-threatening and I do need to call 911, but there's that awkward time between I've called 911, but I still have X number of minutes to wait until they arrive. What do I do? So making sure that there's some training that could be provided for your drivers and dispatchers on this. I could think of perhaps a public health nurse could help with this kind of training, or your local EMT might be able to provide that kind of training as well. Made it. Do we have questions? Feel free to unmute. I have not looked at a chat or anything, Peyton. I'm kind of looking at you to see if there's anything out there.
I was looking in the chat and I don't think there are any questions in the chat right now.
Okay.
Are we sure no one has any questions?
While you're thinking on that, I'm gonna just go through some of the resources. Actually, I just want to show you that picture. Isn't that a cool picture? I love that. That's one of our new contest winners. So all these images, minus maybe a couple, are all from our photo resource gallery that you guys are all welcome to use. So some resources is that a FTA ADA circular 4710.1, that'll help you go to sleep at night because it is a long guidance, but everything's in there. And again, chapter 7 addresses the demand response specific ADA regulations. There's also a nice PowerPoint presentation, which is even easier to read through, about demand response and service requirements. The third one is the Appendix E, which is not difficult to read through either, and that's the reasonable modification request examples. And the FTA ADA reasonable modification is kind of another lengthy document from the FTA that goes into depth about reasonable modification. NADTC has an information brief called ADA Requirements for Section 5310 recipients, which I'm guessing a lot of you have 5310. The lunch and learn that we have next week about Access Matters video series. These are, I think there's 6 not long videos, maybe 20 minutes, that can be used to train transit employees. And it's on kind of how to handle when you have people with disabilities riding with you. And they are from the Northeast, from the Seattle area, so kind of a larger city transit. But there's also some of the video footage was taken in very rural North Dakota, probably similar to some of Kansas. So it addresses kind of both rural and urban, and they're great videos. I really recommend it, and not just for drivers, but any of your transit staff. Last summer, I think we had a webinar called How Can I Assist You? Reasonable Modification to Policy Considerations. That was done by my colleague, Ken Thompson, who's going to be retiring. And then the link to the article or the information about working with hidden disabilities is there, and then our NADTC website. So all of those resources can be of help to you. There's no questions. I'm going to keep giving you more resources.
We did have one question, but I think you kind of addressed it. Is there any training available for our drivers for handling emergency situations and difficult riders? I have 3 drivers. I would like to be trained on this. But that, I think on the last slide you mentioned.
The Access Matters is probably not getting into that very much.
Okay.
There probably is, and I'll get that to you, Peyton.
Okay.
Aside from asking, like I suggested, like local public health or your local EMTs to help with some of that, I do believe we probably have some guidance. Ken, again, I know he goes every week to the Washington, D.C., some transit agency there every week to provide training on this. So I know that there's some more stuff out there. Okay. Yeah, you just can't overtrain people on how to handle this. I'm thinking about that with drivers, people that work as drivers, it's not just driving, it's really so much customer service and handling and working with people. And sometimes drivers, when they're like, oh, that looks like a good job, they aren't necessarily thinking about that. So that training is super important. NADTC is one of 6 technical assistance centers. So our focus is on accessibility for older adults, people with disabilities. There's the National Center for Applied Transit Technology, and they are working on the technology tools. If you have any questions or need assistance with that. National RTAP, Peyton knows all about National RTAP with the rural transportation. NCMM, National Center for Mobility Management. You guys are probably familiar with that. That center is all about mobility management. And then we have our Shared Use Mobility Center, and they are working on equitable, affordable, and environmentally sound mobility. Very interesting work that they do. And then we have a new technical assistance center, about a year old, called the Transit Workforce Center. And they are working on hiring drivers. And they have a great toolkit. We just had them present at a training for us. They have a great toolkit for hiring drivers. And it's some of, if you aren't, it's a lot of it geared towards transit, but a lot of the material could be carried over and used for volunteer drivers or smaller agency drivers. And just mentioning volunteer drivers, NADTC also has a toolkit for outreach to hire volunteer drivers, and it's called, I just lost what it's called, but I will think of it. It is on our website. It's just like totally just went right through my head, but it is on, if I go to my website, I can find it. I'll stick that in there when I send you the other information too.
That sounds good.
And that is all I have. I really encourage you to visit our website and sign up for our e-news. If you haven't already done that, we send out an e-newsletter one time a month, and then we have e-alerts maybe 2 or 3 times a month. So it's not like your inbox is going to get inundated with messages from us, but it's really great information to keep in touch with. And I'm going to stop sharing and see if I see any faces. Any other questions at all or comments? I really am glad to see so many people attend the webinar. It's a really important topic, and I know you're all doing great work transporting people where they need to go, and sometimes it's challenging to provide that service to people with varying disabilities, but thank you for your work. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was a great webinar. I know someone did mention wanting the slides, and you did provide those. So if anyone else is interested in the slides, I can share those after this. But that was great. Thank you so much.
And I'll make sure, I don't know if I put my email in there anywhere, but please feel free to reach out with questions too. It's me. There's my email. And you'll find me on our website too. So thanks, everyone. Enjoy spring as we're trying to get into spring here.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great day.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.